We falsely think of our country as a democracy when it has evolved into a mediaocracy, where a media that is supposed to check political abuse is part of a political abuse.
These commercial entities now vie with the government for authority over our lives. They are not a healthy counterweight to government. They are as big as or bigger than government, and they work closely with government.
The most powerful special interest in Washington today is the media, because not only do they give money and lobby and do all the things that industries do in Washington and companies do, but they, of course, control whether or not a politician's mug gets on the tube. Now, that's power. That's the ultimate power in a political realm, is controlling perceptions.
In George Orwell's novel, 1984, Winston Smith worked at the Ministry of Truth, but his job was not to ensure that truth was preserved. Quite the contrary. His job was to alter past news stories so that the version of the truth given by the ruling elite, the party, was never contradicted. If the party, which Orwell called Big Brother, lied to the people, a quick check of Winston's altered records, the only remaining records, would prove that the lie was true. Can lies become truth? Could a media system controlled by a few global corporations with the ability to overwhelm all competing voices be able to turn lies into truth? These corporations are not answerable to the people. Only the politicians can regulate them. Could corporations possibly buy politicians with campaign contributions? Contributions so large that the politicians would allow unregulated corporations to go about their business of eliminating less powerful voices until only one voice remained. One truth. This documentary actually started 20 years ago when I was in graduate film school. It was around the time of the hostage crisis. It seemed to me at the time that the way the news was being covered was changing, and that this was typified by Rupert Murdoch's New York Post. So I went and I interviewed the editor of the New York Post on video, very primitive video.
Do you think that you people increase public panic sometimes about shortages? Is it possible?
Yeah, yes. I think that's where that's where the panic starts, through the media coverage, through newspaper coverage, television coverage.
Do you think that the New York Post tells the true story? Or?
Well, sometimes you cannot depend on the media. I think what they create is they create, like gas, you can create a panic, right?
New York is a tough town. Can be very abrasive. And I'm not a great believer in adding to anyone's anxieties.
Peter Mitchellmore was quite candid with me that day. Later I found out why.
Are you leaving? Yes, go on.
I became rather incompatible with the newspaper. The paper's fine, it's selling well, but it's not my kind of newspaper anymore. That's it.
That day in 1980, we spoke about the hostages and the new phenomenon of the never-ending story. They were finally released the day Reagan was inaugurated. I didn't think anything of this coincidence at the time. 20 years later, a series of extraordinary events took place. For me, they provided a window. I could see the selling of the Iraqi war, the media's handling of the 2000 election, and the Supreme Court's decision in a new light. The question became whether there was a pattern in the way stories are covered and then dropped. Had it become easier to purposely manipulate the news? Were they not covering certain stories on purpose? Meanwhile, over the years, I had descended into the third world of independent film. But as it happened, right next to the review of my movie was a review of The Insider, a film about the killing of a news story. I took this as a sign. But how to get at the truth? I read about a man named Charles Lewis, an ex-60 Minutes producer who had created a unique nonpartisan news organization. The Center for Public Integrity broke the Clinton-Lincoln bedroom scandal. He had also done a report on George W. Bush's SEC violations for inside trading.
In the 60s, 3 in 4 Americans trusted their government. Today, it's 1 in 4 Americans trust the government. The level of secrecy and the amount of money in our process is greater than it's ever been. Archibald Cox, the Watergate prosecutor I interviewed for our book, The Buying of the President 2000, said the level of trust in this country is worse than he's ever seen it, including during Watergate. People sense, I think, that the financial elites and the political elites have become one and the same, and that the people themselves have no voice in Washington or in their state capitals, that they are somehow being left behind.
When we think about democracy in the United States, we oftentimes, and I think certainly in our media culture and our political culture, the assumption is that the type of democracy we have in the United States is the only type that could possibly exist. It's the high watermark of the human race is capable of, is U.S.-style democracy. In fact, though, I think we have, both in theory and in many ways in practice, a fairly, what you call a weak democracy. I mean, in fact, in many ways, we have a frighteningly weak democracy.
There is an unfortunate sense as well of powerlessness, that there really isn't very much that can be done about the state of things.
You can't have 280 million people and say that 2 political parties represent the thinking of 280 million people. That's just think about that. If you are, just step back and look at that. And you know, the thing is that anthropologists, they're going to dig us up hundreds of years from now, and they are not going to understand us. No, seriously. And we've made a huge mistake inventing film and videotape because we're leaving behind a record of ourselves.
We have a situation in which a significant percentage of the population doesn't vote, doesn't care about the issues, is tuned out entirely, is what we call depoliticized. In fact, we have a rate of depoliticization in the United States that must make a tyrant, like in Indonesia, envious. They say, how can I get one of these vegged out populations?
The top 1% that controlled 90% of the wealth had 2 major political parties doing their bidding for them. And the other 99% had no political party on the ballot representing them, and no representation in Congress representing them. And yet that 99% ran around waving little flags going, we're free, we're free, we live in a democracy, woohoo! Oh, we're gonna look like assholes. No, seriously, folks, we gotta leave a note behind and explain our actions.
We have more instant access to information as consumers and as citizens than we've ever had in the history of the country. That does not necessarily mean we're better informed. And that's a fascinating irony by itself.
There's an apposite quote from Dr. Goebbels. It's a kind of an explosive, thing to invoke here, but he said once, and this is an example of how sly he was, that what you want in a media system, and he meant the Nazi media system, is ostensible diversity that conceals an actual uniformity.
The truth of the matter is that increasingly what we see, what we hear, and what we read is being controlled by fewer and fewer large multinational corporations.
People don't appreciate this. In the last days of the Soviet Union, you had dozens of newspapers, dozens of magazines, all kinds of radio and television stations. The only problem is that all of that media was controlled by the Communist Party of the Soviet Union or the government of the Soviet Union. We are moving in that direction.
There is an illusion of of choice that's maintained when you can have 100 channels on your cable system, and how many movies did the studios release a year now? All these different studios, and the music industry with so many labels, and magazine stands that go on and on and on forever. Well, the owners are a handful, 5, 6 different companies.
And that is a very dangerous development for those of us who believe in a vibrant American democracy.
When polls tell us that fewer and fewer people understand the political process, what the media does is trivialize what goes on, sensationalizes it, makes it entertainment, rather than saying, look, the function of the media is to educate you to live in a democracy, which is pretty serious stuff.
You got a media system that's basically a subsidiary of corporate America. That's all it is. You're going to have a media system that will not cover stories of tremendous public moment, while it will overfocus on trivial stories that don't have any resonance at all.
In terms of the political process, you ask yourselves, what are the most important issues facing our country? Why is it? Simple question. With all of the growth in technology, with all of the wonderful globalization and free trade, all of that stuff, all of the increases in education, why does the average American today work longer hours for lower wages than was the case 25 years ago? Simple question. Do you think it's seen on television very often? What about the morality of 1% of the population owning more wealth than the bottom 95%? Seen that?
In a New York Times editorial, Princeton economist Paul Krugman addressed one of these little-mentioned issues. According to the nonpartisan Congressional Budget Office, between 1979 and 1997, income for families in the middle rose 9%. Income for families in the top 1% rose 140%. Krugman noted, quote, "I know from experience that even mentioning income distribution leads to angry accusations of class warfare." He then asks, why has the response to rising inequality been a drive to reduce taxes on the rich? Good question. According to Joan Didion, news is no longer just reported but managed in a way that sets its terms and shapes its overall content. Has the mainstream media become an anti-democratic force in the United States?
What you want to say is, if you have a self-governing society, a democratic society, what does that society need from its journalism? I mean, what are the attributes you need to have from your journalism, from your media system to produce, so that people can govern their own lives effectively? And I think there were 2 or 3 things that jump out at you if you study the matter at all. And they're really not debated. One, you need a really hard watchdog. You need a journalism that keeps track of people in power and people who want to be in power.
Hitler says in Mein Kampf that the people's power of forgetting is enormous. This is the case with mass society, right? You have to have a healthy media system in order to counteract that natural tendency. You've got to have that, because then people will be sufficiently roused by the notion of having to protect their interests to pay attention. Otherwise, if it's just a spectacle, if it's just a bunch of razzle-dazzle and bullshit, people will naturally, forget about it in a couple of days, and that's the pickle that Americans tend to be in.
A CNN Gallup poll conducted in March 2003 found that 51% of the American people thought Saddam Hussein was personally responsible for the September 11th attack. Why did they think that?
Forget about forgetting. They don't know. They don't know. I picked up my local paper today. Yesterday there was a vote in the House of Representatives which would have provided, which passed, which would, if it carries into law, provide hundreds of billions of dollars in tax breaks to a handful of families in this country. Wasn't mentioned in the newspaper. The repeal of the estate tax, half of the benefits of that repeal will go to the richest 1/10 of 1% of the population. All of the benefits will go to the wealthiest 2% of the families in America. You got that? 98% of the families do not pay 1 nickel in estate tax. I walked down the street a couple of months ago. Guy goes up and he says, Bernie, I'm really angry at you. You know, why are you angry? I've got $20,000 in the bank, and I want to leave my money to my kids, and why are you stopping me from doing that? $20,000. This guy's not going to pay 1 penny in estate tax. People don't know that. So what they do is they poll. They got very good pollsters, and you play off the general ignorance of the population. People don't know much. Death tax sounds pretty good. Everybody who dies, you got to pay a huge tax to the federal government. Not true.
We put the death tax on the road to extinction. The death tax is a bad tax.
And yet that 99% ran around waving little flags going, we're free! We're free! We live in a democracy! Woohoo!
Your job is, if you're at the network, to cover the basics. The basics mean that government, the entire federal government with millions of employees, is boiled down to the White House and the Capitol. You have a reporter at each place, and they're on every night. And that's the extent of your federal government news coverage. It's idiocy.
Shocking.
It's shocking and it's pathetic. And so you can have an SNL scandal that goes on for years and no one notices because that's an obscure, now defunct agency called the Federal Home Loan Bank Board. Well, how many reporters do you think are down there covering that? Hardly any.
If a member of Congress gets an appropriation for $58,000 in order to put some funding into a house or something, or into something in his community, it's liable to make the front pages. Congressman Jones gets pork, $58,000 for this stupid project, headlines. But when you spend hundreds of billions of dollars, it is more likely that the hundreds of billions will not be covered than the $58,000.
How did journalism get this way?
To remove controversy from story selection. So you can't be yelled at for why did you put this in the front page and didn't cover some other story. There becomes a tremendous reliance upon official sources as the basis of legitimate journalism. This was a new thing. You know, in 1875, if the governor said something wacky, a newspaper editor would say, I'm not going to cover that, it was stupid.
Newspapers, they don't invent stories. They go to people, experts in this country, for their opinions on what's coming down or not coming down.
It means those people in power, political power especially, but also business power, are sort of the assignment editors of journalism. What they want to talk about becomes news. If they agree that they don't want to debate something, like the CIA, it's virtually impossible for a journalist to introduce that as a story.
If the media had been on the job during the 2000 election, for example, if they had reported what was actually going on and reported it with all due emphasis and repetitiousness, kept on the story day after day. I don't mean the occasional piece on page 10 of the New York Times. I mean appropriate coverage where you follow the scandal. If that had happened, Bush Cheney wouldn't be in the White House today because they weren't elected.
The range of inquiry by journalists was strictly determined by what the official sources were saying. In this case, the Gore campaign and the Republicans, the Bush campaign. And journalists basically, their credible journalism volleyed between these two positions. Now, the problem with that was very simple. The two sides were playing by very different rules, very different game plans. On one side, you had the Republicans, and they were committed to winning this election no matter what. Principle be damned. They were taking power, period. That underscored everything they did. So there was no commitment to being principled whatsoever. One day, if you got the right ruling by the state Supreme Court, it's clearly a state issue. The ruling 2 days later goes against you. The exact same people say it's clearly a federal issue. There was no sense of shame. The point was you wanted power, period. And it was an extraordinary propaganda effort by the right, because you couldn't even find a Republican dog catcher in Idaho who would disagree. Everyone barked out the exact same line every day. It was Joe Goebbels would have been impressed with the lockstep in which the Republican machine marched in their eagerness to take power and take this election. The problem was, for those of us who just think whoever gets the most votes should win and wanted a fair election, the journalism didn't reflect that interest. It was a prisoner of that range of debate, and therefore it played directly into the hands of the Republicans.
The BBC reported that 5 months before the 2000 election, Governor Jeb Bush moved to purge 57,000 people from the voting rolls, supposedly ex-felons.
The great story that was broken by Greg Palast from Britain, which has now been confirmed, on for the first time, the use of by Catherine Harris of this private company to come up with a list of felons who wouldn't be permitted to vote, which was a dreadfully bogus list of thousands of people who weren't permitted to vote, who should have been.
According to Palast, a private firm with Republican ties, Database Technology, signed a $4 million contract to provide scrub lists of ex-felons. Part of the job was to verify the list, which the firm acknowledged was inaccurate.
The state of Florida brought in this Republican firm on the excuse that they had these databases, and when the company said, well, now we want to run the databases against this list of 57,000 names, there's a little handwritten notation that says, in Catherine Harris's office, right on the listing of the database checks, it says, don't need. We will give you, what they told DBT, we will give you the check if you don't check. How many of these names are wrong? Statistically, 1 in 20 people on the list may have committed a crime. So 95% of the people on the list, 95% of the people on the list, are kind of innocent. Now when I say kind of innocent, see, 54% of the people on the list are unequivocally guilty of being black. Now you do the arithmetic, okay? 95% of a list of 57,700 people, 54% of them black. Catherine Harris certified the election of the President of the United States on the basis of a plurality in Florida of 537 votes. You do the arithmetic and you tell me what happened in that election.
Palast, when he first broke it, CBS News called him up. And CBS News said, yeah, we might want to work on this. And Palast said, well, go ahead, follow up on it. You can have it. Nothing happened for a couple of days, so Palast called up the producer at CBS News and said, why aren't you covering this? And the producer said, and I'm paraphrasing, well, we called up Governor Jeb Bush's office, and he said that it wasn't true, it didn't check out, so we're not going to go with it.
We did not do any kind of frontal, direct investigation of the media for 10 or 11 years, mostly because our information we put out with news conferences and things like that is disseminated through the media. So it would be, I'm being very candid here, it would not behoove me to investigate the media on a regular basis because none of the information would ever be reported and my organization would never be heard from again. And so I'm not stupid, I do recognize that fact. But I have been getting so frustrated, and I decided it was time that we looked at the media. We had half a dozen people working for 6 months, and we investigated, and we found that, of course, that the most powerful special interest in Washington today is the media.
Lobbyists hire placeholders. These people line up first thing in the morning for spots in committee hearing rooms allocated to the public. A few minutes before the hearings begin, the lobbyists arrive.
These guys have hundreds of lobbyists. They have nearly 300 lobbyists, paid lobbyists, and they're giving away tens of millions of dollars in campaign contributions, and they control whether or not a politician ever gets on the air all over America. That's power.
Being successful lobbying at the FCC or Congress is as important to the bottom line as producing a movie that's a big hit. I mean, it's every bit as important. It's more important. That's the, basically stealing stuff from government is the key. And this is where the media companies are extremely successful because they, unlike any other corporate lobby, have one thing going for them the others don't. They actually control the means by which the public can actually learn about these debates. you can imagine Exxon would love to have owned the media, or Philip Morris. So any debate over cigarettes has to go through them.
They took members of Congress on 315 all-expense-paid trips around the world. And then you have the FCC regulating the broadcaster, 1,400 privately funded trips. The problem in this town is that a lot of the regulators that have been set up to protect the public interest have been captured by the people they're regulating, and that's been going on for years. It's not new, but it's outrageous.
Regulators, the Federal Communications Commission, almost always upon leaving office, go to work for the people they were supposedly regulating in the public interest.
Beneath the reported story of greedy Enron executives is a story about the influence of money over government regulators. This is what has happened with the media companies.
Had been well designed. Crazy, crazy Jane is dancing. Crazy Jane's the dancer. Crazy Jane's the dance. See her, pirouette on sorrow, offer up tomorrow.
Rupert Murdoch. You all know Rupert? Right. Rupert is one of the smartest and most dangerous people in this country.
Rupert Murdoch is the primary owner of the News Corporation. In the United States, he owns the Fox News network. But Murdoch's media empire is global. Among his many holdings is a satellite TV service in partnership with the Chinese. Just as he gave a huge book deal to Newt Gingrich, Murdoch gave the supreme Chinese leader's daughter a book contract to write a biography of her father.
Well, if I'm going to get my book published in your capitalist society, I have to find a capitalist to publish it. Regardless of whether it's one of Mr. Murdoch's companies or not.
The nature of what used to be considered a bribe has morphed into a quid pro quo, an indirect payment, and it's legal.
We have massive problems with what I call legal corruption all over America, where the system has been gamed by various powerful interests, and it's all disclosed, of course. Of course, no one reads it, and the media doesn't generally report it. Don't get me started. And so this is a wink and nod exercise with rampant corruption, and the American people kind of actually, in a very interesting way, viscerally understand that things are corrupt. I was a producer at 60 Minutes and worked in network television for 11 years, ABC and CBS, 60 Minutes, and I was an investigative reporter for those places. And I quit one day. My story led the show. I quit because the idea of everything being simplified down to good guys and bad guys, and you know, the formulaic infotainment thing was getting a little old for me. I decided that I didn't want anybody telling me what to investigate, and I was going to decide myself what to investigate, and I was going to take as long as I needed, not 2 weeks to solve a 20-year-old unsolved murder. Today, you know, we're up to 35 people. It's, knock on wood, been very exciting, but that's how it got here. So. You have this contracting of ambition about what should be covered and what the public has a right to know about. The price of power in Washington, who really makes money and who really benefits from the decisions. What will pass for investigative reporting is though someone may get a hold of an early report from some committee that's about to come out, or an inspector general's report that's going to castigate the secretary of this or that. And so you'll breathlessly go on the air and, you know, you'll say ABC News has learned, or whatever the network is, and you'll be out of breath, and it's all exciting, and you're holding up a report, and it'll look like the faceless minions that comprise the network, hundreds of them out there ferreting information out for you to serve the public. It's a complete bunkum, of course. It's not happening at all. The public would never know from the media that they spent $11 million to keep any free airtime provisions out of any legislation, successfully, by the way.
Edward Fritz, head of the National Association of Broadcasters, called free airtime for candidates unconstitutional and an infringement on the broadcasters' free speech rights.
You have reached the stage in American politics, and I'm not kidding you, where the issue is not a debate over ideas. You have a point of view, I have a point of view. Who should that person support? That's what democracy is about. The issue is whether ideas at all matter. You look like a nice fellow. Nice wife. You have any kids?
Yeah, 2.
Okay. Why wouldn't I want to vote for you?
One of the strange things about it is that politics is now presented in terms of politicians and not politics. I don't think the media are interested in politics. They're interested in politicians, which is a wholly different subject.
Media corporations don't cover the news when it comes to politics anymore. The political news coverage in 2000 was half what it was in 96. 96 was half what it was in 92. The third leading source of revenue for the media today, broadcast media, happens to be political ads. So if you're a politician, the only way you get heard is with ads. In 1981, the media was getting $80 million from political campaigns for ads. Today, the last campaign, they got $1 billion. That's why you've got to have millions of dollars to run for office as a politician. You're either a millionaire, you're able to raise large sums of money all day, dollar for dollars, and that's who goes into politics. And you are complicit in this system. You're not going to rock the boat.
You know, 98% of those who run for Congress, who run again, get elected, get reelected. We have a 98% return rate in Congress. Are you aware of this? Do you know, I looked up the statistic. The old Soviet Politburo had a 92% return rate. All right? They actually have more turnover than we have in the U.S. Congress. Is that just the most embarrassing thought? Why do we do this? We've got to change these laws.
We grant these monopoly rights to TV stations. They don't pay a penny to the people for getting these monopoly rights to TV frequencies. Then they turn around and sell time on the public property and make billions of dollars and destroy our political system. All the while, they pay off the politicians themselves to keep getting these monopoly rights. The corruption here is dreadful.
The public is really at a loss. What do you do about that exactly? I'm not quite sure. I mean, they're probably in a perfect world, there should be a citizens movement about this. People should be marching in the streets. I mean, in some ways, we should be as angry about what's happened to our media as the Russians ought to be about what happened to their media. Now, that would be seen as heresy inside the networks. How dare you? We covered stories all the time last week. Look at this story, look at that story. They would take issue with what I just said.
They'd probably call you un-American.
They would call me un-American and a bomb thrower, and I probably won't be on any of their airwaves anymore after this interview.
10 years ago, 50 companies ran the media in America. Now it's down to 5 to 7. Tonight, as I came down here, NPR was reporting on decisions that the FCC, under the control of Michael Powell, son of Colin Powell, who when asked about whether or not there was a digital divide in the world, said, "I'm more worried about the Mercedes divide. I'd like to have one, but I can't afford it." That's the commissioner of the FCC, who is about to lift all the ownership caps on big media companies, and an issue that is not covered in the media.
Michael Powell was actually quoted as saying that he has no idea what the public interest is. The oppressor here is regulation. He actually said that.
Michael Powell and Republicans in the office at the FCC, we were on the verge with our campaign of making major changes to the rules and the public interest obligations of broadcasters. The Federal Communications Commission had proposed rules that we pushed in this campaign. I mean, that hundreds of Americans in small communities, in large communities, pushed. We were going to get rules that would make local broadcasters much more accountable to their interests. Those rules were proposed once Bill Kennard was out of office and Michael Powell was in office. Those rules went into a drawer. They were never voted on.
Starting with Ronald Reagan, the holy grail of deregulation has been sold to the public, and the news media has largely ignored its disastrous results.
once the Reagan administration was done, there were more rules. But they called it deregulation. It's almost this Orwellian use of language where you create new rules, but the rules change because they benefit industry, and you call it deregulation. And you say deregulation, and people feel that's good because people like deregulation. People like fewer rules. They like, depending on simpler, cleaner, old Western rules. But it's a trick. It's not really what's happening.
I remember when I first went into television, I believe the FCC rules were very stringent about how many television stations a network could own. I think it was 5. And of course, they had to be in different markets. And now, I know here in New York, we're talking about a duopoly. That's the new word. You have the probability, it looks like right now, that News Corporation will be the owners of the Post, Channel 9, and Channel 5 in the one New York marketplace. So yeah, the regulations have eased considerably. The whole ball game has changed, and precisely how that affects different people buying and selling different stations in different markets and how it impacts on the news, I don't know.
In my view, there are tremendous effects that are almost entirely negative. There's almost nothing positive about it. First of all, it leads to these companies are so big, their political power grows exponentially.
It's a democratic issue. It means that one viewpoint will come to dominate in most of the outlets that we use for knowing what's going on in the world.
Many people are not aware that when you watch television, you are watching a program produced by a large multinational corporation that has enormous conflicts of interest.
General Electric and NBC is a perfect example. How can we be sure we're going to get the kind of information we need to have about the nuclear industry, about defense contracts, and all of those things when NBC is beholden to this parent company? Why would they report on that? Of course they wouldn't. Why would ABC report on what's going on at Disney? They wouldn't. There's no point in it. And it's precisely for that reason that those companies want to own television stations in the first place, so that they can keep a check on those sorts of things.
General Electric has made it a very proud part of their policies that they are going to move jobs from the United States of America to China, to Mexico, any place in the world where they can get cheap labor. This suggests obviously that General Electric is deeply concerned about our trade policies. Over the years, General Electric has done its best not to pay taxes, or to pay as little as they can in taxes, taking advantage of all kinds of corporate welfare tax loopholes. Suggests very strongly that General Electric has an interest in tax policy. General Electric is a major polluter. Therefore, they're concerned about weakening environmental policies. It's not obviously just General Electric. It's the same thing with CBS or ABC. The conflicts of interest are enormous, and the result is that certain issues are talked about, certain issues are not talked about.
In close to 11 years, we've done more than 100 reports. They're reports and investigations about public servants screwing up. We're the ones that broke the Lincoln bedroom scandal about the Clinton White House. But I have to tell you, when we've investigated corporations, for some reason it just doesn't get covered. What can I say?
See the Business Week cover a short while ago. The majority of Americans believe that corporate America is just one corrupt institution that needs to be reined in.
In some ways, corporate power is treated by our news media much like communism was treated by the Soviet press. You know, in the Soviet media, the bad commissar who didn't meet the tractor quota could be skewered in the media. Pravda or TASS could give the guy a hard time. But the system of communism was off limits. And in many respects, the occasional capitalist or firm that might make a bad tire or bad seatbelt can be skewered. But the system as a whole is always off limits.
In my entire political life, not one reporter has ever come up to me and said, Bernie, you know, the average worker is today working longer hours for lower wages than 25 years ago. What the hell are you doing about that? Why do people have to work 50 or 60 hours a week? Never been asked me.
Why not?
Because those are questions that the reporters are not allowed to think about. You are, in a sense, you know, people say, well, do you think, Bernie, that there's a conspiracy, that Jack Welch is on the phone to every reporter for NBC telling them what to ask? Of course not. But what goes on, there's a framework of thought that you are allowed to have, and it goes from here, it goes to there.
And everybody kind of has the same mindset. You know, this story plays, this is a lead because it, you know, it screams. This is a, you know, everybody kind of has the same approach to it.
Everybody knows about Enron and how the guys at the top managed to cash out very handsomely while preventing the pensioners from withdrawing their money in time to prevent complete ruin, financial ruin. Well, I mean, there's a history behind this, you know. George Bush, who is, of course, a good friend of Kenneth Lay, cashed out in exactly the same way, you know, as a major shareholder in Harkin.
According to the Center for Public Integrity, George Bush served on the Harkin Energy's board and was able to realize a huge profit of $848,000 by selling his stock in the corporation. Harkin had concealed its losses by selling some of the firm's assets to a group of insiders and declaring a profit. Shortly after he sold, the stock price plummeted. He reported the sale to the SEC 34 weeks late. Bush was on the Audit Committee and the Restructuring Committee. He claimed he didn't know.
I propose some tough new standards for corporate reform. Like you all, I took a look out there and saw a problem. And the problem was we had some folks who were trying to fudge the numbers. We had some people who decided they weren't going to tell the truth when it came to their assets and liabilities.
The Harkin inside trading story was reported by the Center for Public Integrity 7 months before the presidential election, but the mainstream media chose not to report the story.
This represents a kind of insider trading. It's obviously epidemic at the top.
In the 2000 election campaign, the mainstream news media hinted that Al Gore was a liar. At the same time, the press ignored or glossed over serious questions about George Bush. From repeated allegations that he had gone AWOL to inside trading. Is there a connection between Bush's avowed policy to completely deregulate big media and their see no evil news coverage? Call it a coincidence.
You know, they'll cover whatever they damn well please, and it's not going to get in the way of the bottom line. It's not going to cost a lot of money to produce, and it's generally not going to upset the powers that be, of which they are a major part themselves. And that's where we are as a country, and it's really grim to watch. It's very depressing.
Bush made millions of dollars as governor of Texas, and his father is now making millions of dollars as a worker for Carlyle, making millions of dollars thanks to the policies of his son. His son has all around him in the White House and throughout the government all kinds of people from Lockheed Martin. And Lockheed Martin's making out like a bandit because of the war on terrorism. This is a scandal of such magnitude, you know, that you'd think that the press would be thanking its lucky stars that it happened on their watch because it's such a great story. No, it's too big for them to cover.
We know what to do with someone caught misappropriating funds. But when confronted with evidence of a systematic attempt to undermine the political system itself, we recoil in a general failure of imagination and nerve.
Very sick, an American diplomat, wrote a book called The October Surprise, in which he argued that the Reagan team seems to have basically meddled in the situation to make sure that the hostages didn't get released.